July 29, 1944. Captain Howard Jarrell was in serious trouble. His B-29 Superfortress, tail number 426358, nicknamed Ramp Tramp, had just bombed the Showa steelworks in Anshan, Manchuria. But now, on the return flight across the Sea of Japan, the number 3 engine was on fire. The propeller windmilled uselessly. Fuel gauges showed critical. He had 300 miles of open ocean ahead and no way to make it back to his base in China. Jarrell made the only decision he could. He turned north toward the Soviet Union. The Soviets were technically allies. He expected a few weeks of internment, maybe some paperwork, and then repatriation through Iran. What Captain Jarrell did not know, what nobody in the American military could have predicted, was that his emergency landing was about to hand Joseph Stalin the most advanced bomber in the world. And Stalin was not going to return it. He was going to take it apart, measure every piece, photograph every wire, and build an exact copy. Not just one copy, 847 copies. This is the story of how a single emergency landing turned into the greatest reverse engineering operation in military history. The story of how the Soviet Union skipped 10 years of research and $3 billion of development costs by simply copying America's most expensive weapon, bolt by bolt, rivet by rivet, even the mistakes. When Ramp Tramp touched down on a dirt airfield near Vladivostok, Soviet soldiers immediately surrounded the aircraft. The crew was taken into custody. They were treated well, fed, questioned politely. They assumed this was standard procedure. They had no idea that while they were being debriefed, Soviet engineers were already crawling over their aircraft with tape measures, calipers, and cameras. Within days, 2 more B-29s made emergency landings in Soviet territory. General H. Arnold, the USS Ural, landed on August 20th near Vladivostok after a mission against Yawata, Japan. And another, the name lost to history, landed in November. 3 B-29 Superfortresses, 3 of the most advanced strategic bombers ever built, all sitting on Soviet soil. Stalin saw them, and he understood immediately what he was looking at. These were not just bombers. They were the future of strategic warfare. The B-29 could fly higher, farther, and carry more bombs than any aircraft the Soviet Union possessed. It had a pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, an advanced fire control system, and engines that produced over 2,000 horsepower each. More importantly, it had range. It could fly from Soviet air bases and reach targets 3,000 miles away. Like American cities. The Soviet Union had nothing remotely comparable. Their heavy bombers, the Petlyakov P-8 and the Tupolev TB-7, were obsolete. They were slow, vulnerable, and had half the range. Developing a new strategic bomber from scratch would take a decade and cost billions of rubles the Soviet Union did not have. Stalin called in Andrei Tupolev, the Soviet Union's leading aircraft designer. Tupolev had designed some of the USSR's most successful aircraft, but he had never seen anything like the B-29. Stalin's order was simple and absolute. Copy it exactly. Not inspired by. Not based on. Exact copy. Every dimension. Every material. Every system. Tupolev tried to explain the challenges. The B-29 used American materials, American alloys, American manufacturing standards. The Soviet Union used the metric system. The Americans used inches. Soviet factories had different tooling, different capabilities. Stalin was unmoved. Copy it exactly, he repeated. If there is a hole in the wing, copy the hole. If there is a repair patch, copy the patch. I do not care if you understand why the Americans did something. Just copy it. Tupolev understood. This was not a request. The reverse engineering operation that followed was one of the most ambitious and meticulous technical projects in Soviet history. The 3 B-29s were transported to a secret facility outside Moscow. Teams of engineers, metallurgists, and machinists descended on them like surgeons performing an autopsy. Every single part of the aircraft was catalogued, measured, photographed, weighed. The B-29 had 105,000 individual parts. Every single one had to be documented. The Soviets created over 100,000 detailed drawings. They disassembled entire sections, down to the last bolt and wire. They analyzed the aluminum alloys. The Americans used alloys the Soviets did not have domestic equivalents for. Soviet metallurgists had to reverse engineer the metal itself, determining the exact composition through spectroscopic analysis and then figuring out how to produce it. The wiring was color-coded using American standards. Soviet factories used different color codes. They had to create new dyes. The instruments in the cockpit used English labels and imperial units. Soviet engineers had to convert everything to Cyrillic and metric, but they kept the same layout, the same panel positions. The Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines were technological marvels. 18 cylinders, 2,200 horsepower each, supercharged, fuel-injected. Soviet engineers took them apart and measured every tolerance, every clearance, every bearing surface. They reverse-engineered the carburetors, the magnetos, the turbochargers. The result was the Shvetsov Ash-73 TK engine. It was a direct copy. The remote-controlled gun turrets were particularly challenging. The B-29's fire control system used analog computers that calculated lead angles automatically. Soviet engineers had never seen anything like it. They copied it anyway, down to the circuit boards and servo motors. One of the most famous stories from the project involves a small patch on the wing of one of the B-29s. During a repair at some American base, a mechanic had installed a patch over a small hole using a specific pattern of rivets. The Soviet engineers found this patch. They photographed it, measured it, and copied it exactly, patch and all, onto the Soviet aircraft. They did not know if it was structurally important or just a quick fix. Stalin had said copy everything, so they copied everything. The Soviets even copied mistakes. One B-29 had a manufacturing defect, a slight misalignment in a structural member that Boeing's quality control had missed. The Soviet copy had the same defect in the same place. The entire fuselage was copied within a tolerance of 340 pounds. On an aircraft that weighed over 70,000 pounds empty, that is 99.7% accuracy. Without blueprints, without manuals, just tape measures, calipers, and obsessive attention to detail. The challenges were enormous. The Soviet industrial base was not designed for this kind of precision. American factories used mass production techniques, standardized parts, and quality control systems that Soviet factories simply did not have. Soviet machinists were used to working with rougher tolerances, aircraft parts that were close enough. The B-29 required precision. Every part had to fit exactly. Soviet factory managers were given quotas and told that failure was not acceptable. Entire production lines were retooled. New alloys were developed. New manufacturing processes were created. Tupolev's team worked around the clock. The project involved over 900 factories and research institutes across the Soviet Union. 60,000 workers. Everything from the smallest screw to the largest structural beam had to be reverse-engineered and then mass-produced. The pressure was immense. This was Stalin's personal project. Engineers who failed disappeared. Managers who missed deadlines were replaced. But slowly, impossibly, it worked. By 1947, just 3 years after the first B-29 landed in Vladivostok, the first Soviet copy made its maiden flight. It was designated the Tupolev Tu-4, NATO reporting name Bull. To American observers who saw it later, it was shocking. It was not similar to the B-29. It was identical. Same wingspan, same fuselage length, same engines, or near enough that the difference was invisible from the outside. Same gun turrets, same tail design, even the same nose profile. The only visible differences were the red Soviet stars instead of American white stars, and Cyrillic lettering instead of English. Everything else was a clone. The Americans did not know about the Tu-4 until August 3, 1947. That was the day Stalin decided to unveil his new bomber to the world. It was Soviet Aviation Day, a massive air show over Tushino airfield outside Moscow. Foreign military attaches were invited, including American officers. The show began with fighters, transports, and older bombers. Then the finale. A formation of 4 large, silver, 4-engine bombers flew overhead, in perfect formation. American observers looked up, squinted, and froze. "Those are B-29s," one officer said. "But that is impossible. The Soviet Union does not have B-29s." They kept circling. The American attaches pulled out binoculars, red stars, Cyrillic markings. These were not American aircraft, but they looked exactly like American aircraft. The formation made another pass, then another. The Americans realized what they were seeing. The Soviets had somehow acquired B-29s and were flying them in formation to show them off. What the Americans did not realize yet was that these were not captured aircraft. These were Soviet-built copies. And there were not just 4. There were dozens already in service, with hundreds more in production. The implications hit American military planners like a freight train. The B-29 had a range of over 3,000 miles. If the Soviets had operational B-29 copies, they could reach any target in Europe. They could reach targets in the Middle East. And most terrifyingly, if they staged through Arctic bases, they could potentially reach American cities. The Soviet Union now had a strategic bomber force. And worse, they had not spent a decade developing it. They had stolen it. The Cold War strategic balance had just shifted overnight. The production numbers tell the story of Soviet industrial capability under pressure. The first prototype flew in 1947. By 1949, the Soviet Union had over 300 Tu-4s in service. By 1952, 847 Tu-4s had been built. For context, America built 3,970 B-29s from 1943 to 1946, over 4 years, with the most advanced industrial infrastructure in the world. The Soviet Union, still recovering from a war that had devastated its western territories, built 847 copies in 5 years, starting from zero, without blueprints. It was an achievement that demonstrated the terrifying power of Soviet centralized industrial planning. When Stalin wanted something, entire sectors of the economy could be redirected to make it happen. The cost to the Soviet Union is harder to calculate because Soviet accounting was opaque and often fictional. But estimates suggest the program cost between $500 million and $1 billion in 1940s currency. That is a fraction of the $3 billion America spent developing the original B-29. The Soviets saved billions by skipping research and development. They also saved a decade. American engineers had spent 10 years developing the B-29, from initial concepts in the late 1930s to operational deployment in 1944. Soviet engineers went from first measurements to operational aircraft in 3 years. Reverse engineering is faster than innovation. That is the brutal economic lesson. If you can steal technology, you can leapfrog development timelines and save enormous amounts of money. Their strategic impact was profound. The Tu-4 gave the Soviet Union a credible nuclear delivery system almost immediately. When the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb in August 1949, they already had a bomber capable of delivering it. American war planners had assumed the Soviet Union would not have a strategic bombing capability until the mid-1950s. They were wrong by nearly a decade. This changed everything. It changed NATO defense planning. It changed American air defense spending. It forced the development of early warning radar systems and interceptor aircraft. The entire Cold War arms race accelerated because Stalin had managed to copy one aircraft. The Tu-4 remained in service until the late 1950s, when it was finally replaced by more modern Soviet designs like the Tupolev Tu-16 and the Myasishchev M4. But by then, it had served its purpose. It had closed the strategic bomber gap. It had proven that Soviet industry could match American technology. And it had terrified the West. Captain Howard Jarrell and his crew, the men who made that emergency landing in Vladivostok in July 1944, were eventually repatriated through Iran in 1945. They never knew what their aircraft had become. They never knew that their emergency landing had handed Stalin the key to the Soviet Union's nuclear deterrent. They never knew that Ramp Tramp, the B-29 they had nursed across the Sea of Japan on 3 engines, would be copied, measured, and rebuilt 847 times. The story of the Tu-4 is a perfect example of how wars are won and lost in ways that have nothing to do with courage or tactics. This was not a victory of Soviet pilots over American pilots. This was a victory of Soviet industrial capacity and ruthless efficiency over American assumptions about technological security. The Americans assumed that the complexity of the B-29 made it uncopyable. They assumed that without blueprints, without manuals, without access to American manufacturing techniques, the Soviets could never replicate it. They were wrong. The Soviets proved that with enough determination, enough resources, and enough fear of Stalin's displeasure, anything could be copied. The lesson echoes today. Technology theft is not a new problem. Reverse engineering is not a modern concept. In 1944, 3 B-29s landed in the Soviet Union by accident. By 1947, those accidents had become 847 strategic bombers. That is the power of reverse engineering. That is the power of industrial espionage. And that is the story of how Joseph Stalin turned an emergency landing into a Cold War nightmare, one bolt at a time.